Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This is a transition for us, and since Peter and I will begin to bring some co-conversants on to future podcasts, we thought we would record our discussion of how to go about doing that in such a way that we don't impose our ideas and theories about practice on them, but that we would learn with them and they from us about practice and their own way of being. Well, Peter, in our last conversation, we introduced the next phase of what we're going to be doing in our podcasting to include bringing in practitioners, former students of yours and mine, others leading and not so leading academic, a mix of people to hear their stories about practice. But we have a dilemma because I am never sure how to do enough listening. So that if we want to bring someone in to talk about practice, we're not using 30% of our recording time telling them what we think practice is. The gamble as well as the adventure would be to have them join us and then have in some kind of a natural way, the three of us, engage in a conversation that draws out for our listeners and for us what practice means to them. So I need your advice. What's the best way to proceed when we bring someone in to learn more about their practice, but when any of our listeners want to pause and listen carefully to someone else to see if they can pick up the sound of practice when it's there in the conversation.
Yeah. And to add one complication to the question, I have a sort of a mini conjecture, I guess you'd call it.
Okay.
That, at least some practitioners, and I would want to say many practitioners, but I won't put a percentage on it, aren't really sure that there's any story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
They take so much of their practice for granted. And furthermore, they have had so many cocktail party conversations in which they basically gave their elevator speech about what they did for a living, and had kind of reached the point where the general public couldn't possibly be interested in what they did as their practice, or maybe they could be interested, but they couldn't possibly understand what the person did for their practice. I guess I'm saying in an overly elaborate way that I feel like I've met a number of practitioners who are, without deliberately evading the question of what is it you do, they are hard to interview or hard to get kind of beneath the surface of the practice. And we've actually conjectured along the lines that the practice is a very esoteric thing from the point of view of the practitioner, that it's got a lot of special qualities to it. It is sort of existentially hard to describe, hard to convey the essence of it. So that makes the discovery of the nature of the person's practice, to the extent that I'm right about this, it makes the discovery all the more tricky. We don't want to commit the well-known self-fulfilling prophecy where we try to pour what the practitioner says into the categories of our model, but yet on the other hand, we are trying to learn more about our model by by talking with, at the concrete level, by talking with practitioners.
That's right.
And, maybe what I'm saying maybe is this is why practice doesn't get as much attention in the classroom or the training session.
Or even in the literature, per se.
As we would like it to have, or even in the literature.
Yeah.
That it is elusive. I'm reminded that Fritz Roethlisberger titled or subtitled his autobiography "The Elusive Phenomena" to describe organizational behavior, and he meant really just this: kind of what are we talking about, and are we just imposing our own categories? So I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible to ever penetrate the complexities of an individual's practice, but it is elusive, and it needs to be conducted as a very careful process.
Yeah, that's why I thought it would be an interesting podcast today for the two of us to put our noodles together on how to go about doing that, because I really would like to have some new voices coming in, and I would like to make sure that we don't put people on the spot. But on the other hand, with a very short amount of time, recording time, we need to kind of tease out something that they would like to say, so that it doesn't come across as an elevator speech or as a resume being summarized, but it comes from what we've said many times about one's sense of practice. One sense of practice is holistic. When we're in a state of practice, it's us. It's who we are in the doing. And so there may be some ways to get at that that we might think of on the spot here.
Well, not only is it holistic, it's very contextual, and maybe its contextual nature is one of the things that where a practitioner may feel that there's kind of no way that he or she can really describe what it is they do in any very deep sense. My sense is that if one really wanted to understand another person's practice, you'd be better off at the concrete level, or you might call it the anecdotal level.
Mm-hmm.
It's not kind of, don't tell me about your practice in general. That kind of question is, I'm not sure it's going to go very far.
No.
But tell me about today, or tell me about who that last person you talked to on the phone, what was that about, or where you're trying to grasp the concrete feel of the action to the individual, not just their kind of overall generalization about it. I mean, a person could say, "Well, I get a lot of weird phone calls in this practice, especially early in the week when people are still hungover from the weekend or something." They might make a general statement like that, but when you finally say to yourself, "Well, now what have I really learned about this?" The statement, "I get a lot of weird phone calls early in the week," is not as informative as is a zeroing in on how the practitioner handled one particular phone call, or one particular input from the environment, or one particular knotty problem. What's on your to-do list for today? That kind of a question might yield more than what in general do you do?
Yeah. Even when you pose that, remember once you use as an example as we were teasing out one of the conjectures about the chief of medicine who got the call saying that there was a minister out there trying to get the patients to come out off their beds to fall on their knees and declare their faith.
Yeah.
And he had to immediately respond to that, and he did by referring it to the head chaplain. But it was I'm hearing the same suggestion coming through here, which is know something about the person, maybe the title or their uniform or their having a golf club in their hand will give you a clue as to what they do. But rather than hit them with the big global question, start out by asking them to describe some kind of a moment they've just had that starts to give you more clues as to what that context and what that title, if they have one, is about.
Yeah, and another related method is, I remember I used to have pretty good luck with this when I was a case writer for Harvard Business School. Rather than sit and watch or hear about some event in the past tense, taking a walk with your interviewee, going into their space and examining their tools and technologies and so forth, getting more involved with what they with the stuff that's important to them, the equipment and so forth. It's very easy to be passive about this, but to be actively inquiring is, I think, the posture that one needs to take. And behind this, I guess it needs to be said that as the inquirer trying to find out more about the practice, it's just essential that you be genuinely curious, and that the practice holds some genuine mystery for you that you want to learn more about. If you're going through the motions, if you're just talking to a practitioner because they happen to be conveniently available,
Yeah.
You might stumble over a practice that is fascinating to you. But to me, it's much better to know at the outset that you're talking to somebody who you've always wanted to know what a master canoe maker does.
Yep.
Or you've always been curious about what those guys do up on the top of their ladders on the high tension, high voltage power lines. There has to be some going in curiosity, and it can't be faked. It can't be faked for sure.
Well, I probably babbled a few times in our previous podcasts about why I have to be pretty close to the learners during any events that I've set up, and it is because I'm perniciously curious. I recall so many things, but years ago, there was a little seacoast town, or actually peninsula called Sabasco. And I was wandering around, enjoying the day, and I saw literally the old lobsterman sitting on a stoop, and he was working on a lobster pot, with a hook and some string, and to repair some nets. Now, this is a few years back, but I stopped and said hello, and then I said, you're still working on the wooden trap with netting, and yet I've seen a number of lobstermen who are now using aluminum traps with plastic netting that doesn't break. And he says something to the effect of, well, this is my trap and this is how I do it. And I've caught more lobsters than you'd ever eat in 10 lifetimes. And that opened up, just looking at him working and saying, you have a few minutes, I'd love to hear more about that. And it went on, and I learned that one winter he had stayed in his shack longer than he should have. And the snow went up above the door and the windows, and he was literally trapped in a little shack for a few days. And he didn't, well, it went along with him doing things the old fashioned way. He didn't have a phone, and he didn't have electricity. He had a little wood stove, and he was running out of wood. And I said, well, you're talking to me now. How did you solve that problem? And he said, I screamed like hell every time I thought someone might be coming by, and finally they dug me out. So that's, I think maybe you're saying in much easier and easier to listen to words that you really truly have to care about and be curious about what someone we talk to about practice has to offer. And here's the dilemma. Yet on the other hand, we put together an oral literature about the nature of practice, and we do have a number of conjectures that we'd love to test out. But give me some advice on how we can be getting some reinforcement for our thinking, or at least correction and new direction for our thinking, without putting it out there and stopping them in their story and saying, are you aware that you have a learning practice as well? Or, whatever. So how do we work that balance between our curiosity to see how some of our ideas about practice will correspond or not with the things that they're saying in a natural conversation?
I don't think there's any efficient answer to that question and that concern. It does occur to me that an effective inquirer on these subjects that we're talking about needs to be a person with a quite a good range. Range is not a concept that you hear very often. Um, it has to do with the ability or the I guess it's really a personality characteristic or something to be able to be naturally interested in a wide variety of things and not narrow in any particular way.
Mm.
Or if you're going to be narrow on something that on something that introduces you to a wide range of behavior. Like, for instance, be narrow on the subject of technology. Well, if you're fascinated by technology, then you're going to find it everywhere, and
That's right.
and your antennas start vibrating whenever you get in the vicinity of a technology that you don't understand very well.
Yeah.
All the way from a pencil up to the space shuttle, and so it's important, I think, to say that I'm afraid there are too many behavioral scientists these days who don't have very much range in terms of their interest in organizational behavior. There may be some particular syndrome or whatever that they're quite interested in, but there needs to be quite a bit of flexibility and dimension to a person's interests to do this kind of work.
That's really good advice to all of us listening. And my guess is that we have a lot more range than we've ever been aware of, and we don't know for sure of that until we try it out with different folks and just see if our eye is caught by someone doing something which to many folks would be normal behavior. But if you have some curiosity, because there's something about the way that she or he is performing that in the moment to want to just stop a few minutes, say, can I have a moment or two? I'm kind of curious. And then I'll say, well, what are you up for? Well, I can honestly say I am developing my appreciation of what people do very well, or not very well, but want to do better. I don't even
Yeah.
have to tell them it's called practice. But I can think of a person who I tease every time I go into the library at school. He was our custodian in my building, and now he's working in the library. So I've known him a long while, and he's a wonderful, pleasant person. And my tease is that he's usually cleaning on the entry floor that I come into, and I'll come up and I'll uh, pretend I'm taking a piece of dust off of where he just dusted, or point out a little speck on a piece of glass, and he laughs, and I laugh, and I say, but I tease you, but you have such patience to work. We have hundreds, even thousands of people running through here, and you clean and you clean and you clean, and he'll laugh and everything, and then I say, well, and he'll say, well, there's a couple of things that I do so that I don't have to do it over and over again. And he'll show me a little technique that he's come up with. And maybe something with the way he works a dust rag. It doesn't have to be all grandiose. But once he has shown me that technique, I'm getting more and more of a sense of how he has sustained himself in working very hard and well, even if his pay is not all that great,
No.
for maybe 15 or more years at that school. Day in and day out, he comes back and he cleans, and he comes up with these little ideas. I would then want to know if he has a chance to converse with other people who do the same work at the university to see if they share, I don't want to say best practices, but discoveries of how things could be done more efficiently. But there you go. I've had him in mind for a long while as someone who I'd love to know more about. Not just, I mean, I know he comes from Jamaica and he goes back there whenever he can and loves Jamaican chicken. I know those kind of things. But I'm most curious about why he does so well every time. I'm sure he doesn't have a supervisor over his head, and I know he don't have a bunch of measures that prove or disprove that he's doing the job right. He just does it. So back to you. You triggered that in me, that notion of range, because the last person you'd want to ask anything about how to clean well would be me. But someone who does clean well, I'm all about wanting to know more. Not so much the technique, because, well, unless I could possibly use it, but also about the person and what his janitorial life has meant to him all these years. And particularly when it's a high turnover thing in most institutions. They're outsourced, and they're among people who have a lot better pay and benefits than they do, and yet they're doing the job, and they're doing it very well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so range, and then, but if you're not sure about range, but you are very curious in a relatively narrow way, it still takes you into a lot of lives. Technology is one. What would be another one?
Well, practice itself is such a preoccupation.
Mm-hmm.
To be fascinated by the nature of practice will take you into a lot of interesting venues.
That's the good news.
I want to add one other reminder here. We are talking about a learning process. And so an individual who wants to become more adept at teasing out the nature of another individual's practice, you're not necessarily going to start at the top, so to speak, with that set of interests. You're going to learn to talk to practitioners. You're going to learn what some of their preoccupations are. You're going to learn what tends to turn them on and what tends to turn them off. Those are all processes that are going to unfold for an individual who is interested in becoming more sensitive to the nature of practice and has a fuller understanding of it. And we've been, in these podcasts, we've been sharing some of our own, I guess I'll call them sensitivities.
Yeah.
So we've been calling them our conjectures about the nature of practice. They capture, or they attempt to capture in a few words, things that we have noticed about practice in our own experiences as
the big P,
as teachers. Yeah. And you and I, in the calendar year that we've been at this, and the 3 or 4 more years before that I was working on it, have certainly engaged in a very rich learning process ourselves, so that I think we now talk with more insight and more understanding of the nature of the beast than we had a year ago.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It's one of those things that if you said yourself before, when you started that initial thinking several years ago, it was like it was there all along, but I hadn't quite consolidated my thinking and put a word to it. And you could have called it a whole bunch of other things, but I think where we began was there's theory, there's practice. We know a lot about theory, we talk a lot about theory, we teach a lot about theory, but what about practice? In fact, that's sort of the theme of our whole podcast. But once the notion of rebalancing our attention so that we bring practice up into a field of vision and pump up our curiosities about it, it's there everywhere with anyone you speak with, to the extent that you're genuinely interested in what they have to say. It may not ever come out with a compendium of 1,000 different versions of practice, story by story or person by person. But from the standpoint of our mission as teachers, it does make sense if we can build into our time with learners and our thinking about them before and after we're with them, to be sure that there's a chance for some of their practice life to show up on the screen, and then we can show them the relevance to a particular theory, or in our case, a set of conjectures. But we can't push it on them and say, you see this? See what this means? Do you agree with it? That was a lot of my undergraduate experience. Read the stuff, make sure you understand it. You can show that you have knowledge about the theory, but they didn't go to the next step. So like, okay, I proved that I could recognize this set of concepts. But what I'm saying now is that if we could find ways, as we find ways, not if, to recognize what practice is sounding like in someone's conversation, in their story, we might be able to give them some feedback after we've heard something about how it sort of shaped how it affects us as learners, because that's the way we're entering into this so-called investigation. We're coming in as learners. When we bring someone on in the next podcast or so, we are giving ourselves a treat, and therefore people are listening to this, because you and I both can think of a number of very interesting people who are very comfortable about talking from the point of, describe your last phone call to us. I know the folks that I have in mind would not be stunned by that question. Naturally, they would say, well, I just did get off the phone with someone who blah, blah, blah. And we could bring it out from there. I guess my question now is, how much of a person's title and, when we bring someone on, how much is it fair in our trying to keep this thing easy going to frame who they are without overdoing it? So, for example, if you brought one of your physicians in who you've talked to about in wonderful terms, your primary, he wouldn't necessarily want to give 5 minutes of his credentials before we even get into a conversation, because my sense then is that we pretty much said you just have to embellish what we've already said about you, rather than saying something to the effect that we love to hear more about what it's like for you to be doing the job you're doing today. There wasn't really a question there, but
Well, you're reminding me of one of Fritz Roethlisberger's, I want to say obsessions. But in any event, he was clear in his own mind that theory and practice are in dialogue with each other. And it isn't all one or all the other, that there are certain services that theory provides to practice, and there are certain services that practice provides to theory, and that keeping them in dialogue with each other is an essential process. And I think what you and I have been saying in a variety of different ways in these podcasts is that that dialogue has gotten a little bit out of whack. That theory now tells practice what practice is about, and practice stands quietly and waits for theory to stop talking, and then practice says, "Can I go now?" And
that's right.
Theory says, "Well, I guess so. Oh, one more thing."
Yeah.
And so that they're not in the kind of rich dialogue that they need to be in. The Harvard Business Review always had as a motto, the magazine for the thoughtful businessman.
That's right.
They, of course, be business person now, but I think they expressed that objective of keeping the ideas in the journal in dialogue with men and women who are thinking about their practice and are identifying points in their practice where they have more learning to do, and maybe they will get that learning from reading this magazine. Back and forth, back and forth. I think in particular in our own fields of leadership and management, we've seen examples where some individual will at the level of their practice will come up with some concept or some idea, and that will gradually work its way into a more abstract level and become the object of actual research.
Mm-hmm.
And then that research will generate some findings which will then act back on the original concept and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But that process is not working as smoothly and as richly as it could. And my personal hope is that by emphasizing the nature of practice as we are learning about it, maybe we will make some contribution toward restoring the balance. But on my more pessimistic days, I worry that theory will ever back off enough so that practice really gets a hearing in the so-called halls of academia. I don't really think theory thinks practice has very much to say for itself, and that there isn't really very much there. I think I've quoted to you before a famous sociologist who referred to the practitioner as a horny-handed son of the soil.
No, I hadn't heard that one.
A horny-handed son of the soil.
Well, that'd be my lobsterman up there with it.
Yes.
His hands definitely had.
That's not exactly a very
It's a put down. Yeah,
respectful.
You might as well call him a peasant or or a subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
There is that.
So this happened to be an individual who prided himself on colorful language and concept, and that was an example of one of his colorful characterizations.
Yeah. Well,
And he was not being facetious, I don't think.
No, and probably that's the way he felt. Yeah. Well, how about the flip side of that, though? People out there in the practice world, I picked up on some trends that sound like it's not necessarily anti-intellectualism, but there's this trend that says, maybe there isn't much we can get out of or get from those people in the academy. Let's tune our ear to each other or to other sources of ideas. And the sad part of that to me would be, yeah, but we still support a lot of very deep, thoughtful research that in some fields, it would be much easier for the practitioner if they could have this dialogue we talked about. Feel, even if they're not a student, an enrolled student, that they could pick up a Harvard Business Review and read it, or pick up anything that we write about, including your books and mine, and then feel some kind of gain from that. So back to the question, while theory may be putting a distance out to practice, is practice holding theory at a distance these days, Peter?
Oh, I think so. Way back at the very beginning of our conversation here, half an hour ago or however long it's been, I pointed out that I feel like I've met a number of practitioners who don't really think theory has much capacity to grasp what they do, and isn't really interested. That would be, I guess, an example of your question. But there's an honest side to that too, where the practitioner just doesn't know how to put into words what they really do. I wrote a poem once called the Layman's Lament, and I've since retitled it Satchmos Paradox.
Right. Yeah, you had mentioned that before. That is a great example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, it starts out, you understand something and I don't. Not only do you not understand what I don't understand what you I just play back and forth between.
It is. It's it's a Rubik's Cube.
What I understand and what I don't understand. And I actually had people call me up unsolicited, call me up and say, I have that poem tacked up on my wall right beside my computer where I could see it. Yeah, the Layman's Lament, Satchmos Paradox.
In a way,
I call it Satchmos Paradox, of course, because Louis Armstrong really said, if you don't understand jazz, I can't explain it to you.
Yeah.
And I guess his point is going to be that, how to put this, that if you're gonna learn about jazz, you're gonna learn about it by some other means than didactic explanation.
Right.
That it's not a phenomenon that lends itself to didactic description. And that's true, by the way, of a lot of art, that if you understand it, you understand it by a different process than reading a book about it or listening to a lecture about it. I was watching a public television show on B.B. King last night.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all about playing the blues. And it was just so clear that he could play the blues as well or better than anybody in the world. And he loved to play the blues, and people loved to listen to him play the blues. But he had no interest in explaining what the blues is.
I love that. I love that.
he was very gentle and respectful.
Yeah.
That a person could want to know, tell me what the blues is, but it's just not. It's not the nature of the beast.
Well, in his way of being a blues guitarist, which distinguished him among thousands of others, was probably imbued a lot by his just sheer love of playing the blues and watching people respond and seeing how each time he played it was different, slightly different or greatly different. I think the folks that we should bring into our conversations going forward are more like B.B. Kings in the world than in those who would instruct point by point what practice is to them. And so far, the people I've thought of and you're beginning to think of are more on the artistic sides of what they do in the world than the heavily engineered aspect of their life. So, hey, let's give it a try. I think what we'll find out is how good we are at being appreciative of in our inquiry and listening. Hitting myself on the head when I say that to be sure I do. And I'm quite confident because I even saw you do this when I co-taught with you way, way back. You would get something started with a whole class around some very simple point or question or some object. And then you'd be drawing out more and more thought on that until it was extraordinary discovery in the moment of what they thought, you thought, and then what we put together
Right.
as a not necessarily a conclusion, but as a point to depart from in the next round of thought. That sort of teaching is beautiful to see and experience. So.
Yes, and as you talk, I realize that I will now flip into the role of being a practitioner of in this case a practitioner of that style.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered that I really have no interest in the abstract theory of it. That doing it, teaching that way is sufficient unto itself.
Right.
And if I'm going to do anything about it, I'm going to write a poem about it. But I'm not going to write an essay for the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science about it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think I mentioned once that I really wanted to put forth some pretty good ideas around pragmatism and how it fits into the life of a actual worker. So I wrote a whole novel about it in order to get my point of view out there. So we'll see. Coming up, stay tuned for our next conversation. Hopefully it will be with one of our new co-conversants, and she or he may just be just as interested in our practice, in the study of practice, as we are in what they do and what makes them feel happiest in life. So that'll be coming up next. So any last thoughts on this one, Peter?
No, I think I've pretty much said what I want to say about it for now. I guess I want to remind our listeners that we are talking about a learning process.
Yeah.
So, and it's a learning process, at least in my experience, it's a learning process that can go on for years and years without ever quite feeling like you have it all.
What a great way to live a life, huh?
Just about the time you think you know about the nature of practice, along comes some practitioner who's doing things in a way that is outside the boundaries of anything you've thought about up to this point. That's why I think my point about range is important. To be able to realize that you're hearing about a practice that you had not ever seen before, or that nobody knew anything about, that you were watching a practitioner kind of write the book on that particular practice. The space program produced a lot of individuals like that.
Jim Collins, yeah, we mentioned him.
Yeah, Michael Collins. Yeah.
Oh, Michael Collins, yeah. So it's a learning process, and that's why I think we're going to have fun going forward, try some of these new approaches to our podcasting. And my hunch is that it will be not only a lot of fun, but it'll deepen the overall story that we're telling about practice, but the sound of practice. It'll be more and more in their ear when they're in a conversation and they start hearing people saying or observing people doing things that seem to be more of a practice nature than just casual work. And once you tune into that sound of practice, you got to hear more. You got to hear more Satchmos, you got to hear more B.B. King, you got to hear more Peter Vale, and more Dave Huron.
Dave Huron.
Okay, well, thank you for another great conversation, Peter. We'll talk soon.